Iniciará esta sessão o Sr. Diretor da Faculdade de Letras, Professor Dr. Miguel Tamen, a quem solicitamos que se dirija ao púlpito.
Muito boa tarde, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There's a very brief, if warm, word of welcome to you all. Welcome to the 4th Lisbon Lecture in the Humanities. I need to thank, of course, the FLUL and Professor Arnaldo Espírito Santo, who's been our constant support, as well as João Dionísio. Where is João? Without whom this would simply have not been possible. As I said, this is our fourth lecture in the series. We had Michael Fried, and then Alfred Brendel, and then Shadi Barge, and now tonight we'll have Stanley Fish. The Lisbon Lectures in the Humanities series was actually established to foster, promote, encourage, but at the same time just have people enjoy fleeting moments of intellectual interaction with some of the great minds in the humanities. Indeed, our speaker tonight fully belongs in that category. I must declare an interest in the sense that I'm a reader of Professor Fish and an admirer of Professor Fish, as many of us, of course, are. And so I tend to be my neutrality cannot be fully maintained in this brief introduction. This indeed is not even an introduction, it's actually an introduction to an introduction, because the real introduction will be done by our colleague Joana Matos Frias. So please, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the lecture, and without further ado, Joana Matos Frias.
Good afternoon. Dear Dean, Professor Miguel Tamen, Chairman of the FLUL, Professor Arnaldo Espírito Santo, Professor Stanley Fish, distinguished faculty, esteemed students, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce our internationally acclaimed guest, one of the most preeminent scholars in the humanities and a best-selling author, a lover of reading and running, a bad traveler and a not-so-bad basketballer, fond of fine sentences as well as of fancy cars, of John Milton and Frank Sinatra, Kim Novak and Gertrude Stein. To name but a few of Professor Stanley Fish's well-known fascinations, all of which can be found in his 2015 book, Think Again, Contrarian Reflections on Life, Culture, Politics, Religion, Law, and Education, a selection of nearly 100 of his New York Times columns published from 1995 to 2013. Although Professor Fish has devoted an entire book to the celebrated North American television series aired in the 60s, The Fugitive, it's perhaps a later reference to another TV show, the BBC's Monty Python, that gives us a more accurate overview of his features as a scholar. Whether we're thinking of Professor Fish's work as a teacher of law and literature, as an interpreter and literary critic, as a writer, or even as an administrator, for he has been a revitalizing department chair at Johns Hopkins and Duke universities, and dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he has been conferred the title of Dean Emeritus. In the opening lines of the 2016 book, Winning Arguments, What Works and Doesn't Work in Politics, the Bedroom, the Courtroom, and the Classrooms, Chapter 1, the reader is offered a brief description of a 4-minute sketch by the Pythons known as the Argument Clinic, in which, and I quote from the book, a man played by Michael Palin enters an office and says to the receptionist, "I'd like to have an argument, please." This man is not really interested in any particular topic or set of topics to discuss, but in establishing what he considers to be the boundaries of argument as opposed to verbal abuse or contradiction. Professor Stanley Fish recalls this rather delightful episode as an introduction to a few points of his own reasoning. The truth is that these same points seem to offer one of the most illuminating accounts of the grounds on which he has been working since the very beginning of his career at Yale University, first as a PhD student and then as a chaired professor. These grounds would include an overwhelming excitement about serious argument as something humanly inevitable. Conflict, not agreement, is the default condition of mortality, is one of Professor Fish's aphorisms. An awareness that people cannot, and I quote, engage in abstract arguments. Also that arguments are never abstract because they are inescapably embedded in social or institutional settings. And last but not least, a deep understanding that, and I quote, as an arguer, you're always playing catch-up, trying to deal with the twists and turns you have not anticipated. That is to say, being an arguer is so hard to do because it means paying very serious attention to other people and to what they have to say, a kind of attentiveness that has undoubtedly been one of Professor Stanley Fish's most remarkable endeavors all over the years. An endeavor not only recognizable in the fact that he has probably been responsible for making some question and answer sessions at conferences more significant and thought-provoking than the previous presentations, but especially if we pay some attention to how Fish works book after book. Professor Fish has authored a handful of cutting-edge books on Milton and other 16th and 17th century non-dramatic writers such as George Herbert or Francis Bacon, and I quote, with a special emphasis on the relationship between Christian theology and aesthetic structures. He wrote several essays on questions of interpretation and reader response criticism, on political and social problems connected or not with the academy or the law, and on composition and the art of writing. However, it is certainly not the contents of his interests, but the unique way he works on them that should attract the attention of his readers and listeners. It is not by chance that the formula X versus Y that usually identifies lawsuits has been often adopted by Professor Fish as the title of vehement articles, Fish versus Fish, for example. And that his one-on-one knockdown debates with Dinesh D'Souza have been as well attended as a boxing fight or a rock concert. Because it is learnable, the art of disagreement, according to Professor Fish, implies the rhetorical skill of putting oneself in the adversary's shoes as a crucial basis for serious thought. In 1967, shortly after the Yale University Press edition of his revised dissertation on the poet John Skelton, Professor Stanley Fish published his second book, Surprised by Sin, The Reader in Paradise Lost, written in the British Museum with Harvard University Press. Described by many as a masterpiece of literary criticism, in spite or because of its controversial effects, Surprised by Sin is also the place where we can already observe very clearly Professor Fish's main interests as pursued to date, namely the work of John Milton, always present in most of his writings, and still the main concern in more recent publications, such as 2001 How Milton Works, or 2012 versions of Anti-humanism, and also the work of the informed reader of literary and not necessarily literary texts, carefully and thoroughly reconstituted through the closest reading probably ever performed over almost every line of Paradise Lost. A poem, the legend tells, that Professor Stanley Fish had read 5 times during the summer of '60 at Yale. If Richard Rorty, to whose memory the volume Winning Arguments is dedicated, and with whose winning arguments Stanley Fish has seldom disagreed, was correct in suggesting that there are no cores of academic disciplines, but only reactions to brilliant iconoclastic books, such as The Birth of Tragedy, Philosophical Investigations, or of Grammatology, then, of course, Surprised by Sin is most certainly one of those influential books, having provoked a wave of turbulence both within Miltonian studies and within the field of literary theory and its newborn reader response criticism. Indeed, Professor Fish has avoided the polarized attempt to decide whether Milton was romantically of the devil's party or, on the contrary, in favor of God and his angels, by shifting the focus from external moral and religious concerns to problems derived strictly from the dialectical experience of reading, as enhanced by the way Paradise Lost is written and composed. In this way, he has not only reconciled the two opposing brigades of Miltonists, but has also managed to subsume and overpass the respective claims of the antagonists in a single argument that would also lay the groundwork for his probably most famous collection of articles, 1980, Is There a Text in This Class? The argument supported by the rhetorical claim that both Satan and God have a particular style and a syntax is that Paradise Lost, and I quote, is a poem about how its readers came to be the way they are, that is, fallen. And therefore a poem in which these split and guilty readers are manipulated and constantly surprised by their own sin, and indeed educated through the repetition of this particular kind of surprise. Not surprisingly, though, the keywords that seem to dominate the whole argument are obedience and disobedience, a very early dual key concept in Professor Fish's thought and discourse that is still very useful for our full understanding of his non-literary and more recent writings, such as the challenging chapter on religion and the First Amendment included in 2019's The First, How to Think About Hate Speech, Campus Speech, Religious Speech, Fake News, Post-Truth, and Donald Trump. What I wish to highlight in this example taken from just one of the many books Professor Fish has written and published over the past 50 years is almost hidden in the dedication, and I quote the dedication, to my students at the University of California, Berkeley, 1962-65. It is not a sentimental, patronizing, or even symbolic dedication, for the reader is soon to be informed that the students to whom the book is dedicated have contributed materially to it, and that its author has made use of the insights and suggestions of some of them who are then identified. This is how Fish works, arguing and debating, respecting and responding to the good and bad arguments of others, and valuing the classroom as one of the most important courts in which these language games may occur. This is probably why Professor Stanley Fish has often been portrayed as the most gifted and demanding teacher, both generous and unsettling, provocative and intense, challenging and lively, funny and entertaining, even performative at times. Shortly after Surprised by Sin, Professor Stanley Fish wrote and published what he considers to be his early manifesto. The essay Literature in the Reader, The Effective Stylistics, was written during the summer of 1970, and a history of Professor Fish's summers would definitely be of great use, and then published as an appendix to the volume Self-Consuming Artifacts in 1972, and finally as one of the introductory chapters in Is There a Text in This Class? A book that became one of Professor Fish's best-known works and has been assigned as required reading in many graduate courses in literary theory around the world. As well as being the early manifesto of a single author, the article is the coherent and consistent foundation of the postmodernist academic field that we have come to recognize as reader response criticism, where the relationship between text and reader is subverted based on the recognition that, as Professor Fish will put it in another text, meaning is human. The manifesto was prompted by a crucial debate with Wimsatt and Brooks' then much celebrated The Affective Fallacy, is based on the assumption that meaning is not static or extractable, but an event in time, something that happens to and with the participation of the informed reader, and elaborated through a detailed analysis of the temporal contours and changing effects of some sentences by writers such as Walter Pater. An analysis that was already at work with Milton's masterful sentences and anticipating 2011's splendid How to Write a Sentence and How to Read One. After debating with Wimsatt and Brooks with his own earlier claims, but also, albeit in different tone and terms, with William Empson and Michel Riffater, Professor Fish concludes his argument in the classroom, where most of the chapters will take place. The classroom plays a fundamental role in the book, not only as the main stage on which methods and arguments are rehearsed or tested, but also as the most eloquent proof that the concept of interpretive communities, one of Professor Fish's most famous contributions to the field, is true to life. The pragmatic argument at the heart of the book's eponymous chapter in conversation with Meyer Abrams' essay, How to Do Things with Texts, is brilliantly demonstrated in the very amusing How to Recognize a Poem When You See One, where an anecdote makes it clear that a particular interpretive community, in this case students of literature, may have something like poetry-seeing eyes, which enable them to see poetry where there is none, and that by doing that will also prove that there are no essential differences between literary and non-literary words in texts, a conclusion that speaks for the importance of empirical approaches. This is one of the most crucial arguments in the whole book. Again, the relevance of the concept of interpretive communities lies not only in the fact that it confronts and resolves some problems related to an understanding of interpretation that could lead to the idea of infinitely diverse ways of reading, but also in providing us with a framework that will make it easier to deal with the kind of arguments Professor Stanley Fish would present in books such as The Trouble with Principle or 1994, There is no such thing as free speech, and it's a good thing, too, a title that to this day has provoked the most hasty reactions. Soon, however, an attentive Fish reader, with a little help from his friends Austin and Searle, will understand that if there is no such thing as an abstract, pure, unmediated, or context-free single interpreter of texts, there can be no such thing as an abstract, pure, unmediated, or context-free single speaker. That is, every changing interpretive community is also a changing speaking community made up of its assumptions, rules, agreements, and strategies. In his own words, echoing George Harrison, we live not in a material world, but in a rhetorical one. This is exactly the case with the university, this wonderful world where we shouldn't, and I quote, confuse our academic obligations with the obligation to save the world, because we are allowed to live mainly concerned with protecting the right to exercise our freedom of inquiry and interpretation. In 1999, the book entitled Professional Correctness, Literary Studies and Political Change collected revised versions of the Clarendon Lectures delivered by Professor Fish at Oxford in May 1993. If we read his title, Think Twice, not only as an address, but also as a self-descriptive motto ensuring his own condition as the good physician he has outlined in Self-Consuming Artifacts, then second and extended thoughts on the same kind of concerns can be found later in 2008, Save the World on Your Own Time. Along with 2014 versions of academic freedom, From Professionalism to Revolution, these books contain some of the most controversial and even enraging, yet most firm, sharp, and serious reflections ever written on what it means to be an academic, a scholar in the humanities, and a teacher of literature. And they are perhaps the clearest evidence that one of Professor Fish's most decisive lessons is the importance of seriously confronting and breaking with common sense. Professor Fish's arguments are made on behalf of the dignity, distinctiveness, and professionalism of a condition and a job that should make us proud, not grumpy, as well as of the intrinsic and self-evident benefits of knowledge, criticism, and thought. Just like virtue and unlike politics, Lecture 5 of Professional Correctness reads, literary interpretation is its own reward, an activity not very different from basketball to be valued for its own sake, as Socrates did. This doesn't mean, of course, that literature will make us more virtuous human beings, but it certainly means that the humanities are honorable and praiseworthy because they are their own good. Academic boredom is so often proud of its status quo that its agents pay little attention to the benefits of exercising humor and inventing catchy titles. Fortunately for us readers, Professor Stanley Fish has always engaged in his classroom and writing activities with a keen sense of the importance of being earnest and witty. That is why he has authored a number of essays and books that anyone will immediately want to read or buy, such as The Unbearable Ugliness of Volvos, Still Wrong After All These Years, Truth and Toilets, A Wolf in Reason's Clothing, How to Do Things with Austen and Searle, or No Bias, No Merit, a title that still upsets some sensitive souls. On the other hand, it is thanks to Professor Fish's fine sense of humor that we are able to imagine that the most tiring and repetitive writing exercises are actually the practice of a Karate Kid method of learning how to write, consisting of waxing in, waxing off. Or that a technical term like parataxis is absolutely useless in a learning situation, but it might be useful at a cocktail party. Professor Stanley Fish is even able to combine his love of argument with his passion for good humor in a very rare talent for self-criticism that often provokes our laughter in the dark. He has done this on several occasions, both orally and in writing, as when, after discussing some of Alan Sinfield's assertions, has recognized, Sinfield says that I employ a bullying tone. Well, he has a point there. Professor Stanley Fish has taught in a large number of North American and European universities, I have mentioned only a few, and has received several awards and honors. But when it comes to summarizing his main achievements, what he has to tell us is this. Last year, an old friend whom I hadn't seen for a while called me to catch up. What are you doing this summer? He asked. Writing on Paradise Lost, I answered. But that's what you said 30 years ago, he responded. Right, I replied, yet once more. And if I had thought of it, I would have borrowed a line from my friend David Lodge, who borrowed it from George and Ira Gershwin. Nice work, if you can get it. Yes, he can. And that is why we are so pleased to have Professor Stanley Fish with us today, and look forward to hearing what he has to say to us about such up-to-date, impossible things as blind submission, anti-professionalism, interdisciplinarity, consciousness raising, transparency, and artificial intelligence. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Well, who could ever live up to that? And listening, I realized, as I've realized before, in listening to that magnificent and generous introduction, I realized that I've been writing the same book or essay now since 1962. So I'm now in, I think, my 62nd year of university life. And as the introduction suggested, most of what I've written comes directly out of teaching. That is, I discuss with my students various issues. Problems are proposed, some are even solved, others are merely extended, and then I go out and write a book. And so I've been the beneficiary of the experience of teaching committed students for all of these years. I'm very pleased to be here back in Lisbon. I was last in Lisbon in 1966 when I took a year on a fellowship. It was the year in which I completed the book Surprised by Sin in London, as you have heard. But when I wasn't doing that, I was traveling around Europe. I had barely been out of New England. I'm a native of Providence, Rhode Island, a very provincial town, and most of the people that I grew up with are still living in Providence, Rhode Island, and living with their parents, or in their parents' house. So I was one of the people who got out of Providence, Rhode Island, somehow. So when I toured Europe for the first time in '66, it was with that wide-eyed innocence that can only come from a certain form of provinciality. But I came to Lisbon, and I found it absolutely delightful. And as I was saying to the dean, the best meal I have ever had, I had in Lisbon in 1966 at the Ritz-Carlton. It was duck à l'orange. So if they're still, in fact, offering it, I can still, with confidence, recommend it. Now, the title of this essay, as it has been advertised, is already long enough. But in fact, the title is longer than that, and could be even longer than the longer version of it. Let me explain. The full title of the paper as it presently exists is Impossible Things: Blind Submission, Legal Realism, Textualism, Corpus Linguistics, Critical Legal Studies, Anti-professionalism, Interdisciplinarity, Consciousness Raising, Transparency, and Artificial Intelligence. That, as I say in this paper, is a list that one might find in a Borges novel. And one might think, well, what is it that unites these particular agendas, all of which I am attacking and rejecting? And actually, that was named in the introduction. The two statements singled out: meaning is human and is an event in time. I've been saying that for a long time, and therefore opposing programs and agendas which seem reluctant to recognize that dual fact, that meaning is human and is an event in time. And here I have a list of just such a set of enterprises, to which I could have added others that are familiar to you. I could have added, for example, that miserable development called digital humanities, one of the worst diseases ever visited upon humanities, the humanities culture. Or I could have added to this, and will no doubt, as this is a paper that's obviously going to expand till the end of life, of my life, not to the end of time, but to the end of my life, I could have added cancel culture, which could have been part of this title. I could have also added all of the words, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, ever written by Jürgen Habermas. And I heartily urge you never to read a single one of them. And I could have also included something on which I've written before, which is the attempt throughout the centuries to perfect language in a way that will finally make it like the language presumably spoken by Adam and Eve in paradise. And there have been a long series of such attempts, from the Royal Society of England in the 17th century to the logical positivists at the beginning of the 20th century, and to the worst single essay ever written by a major author, George Orwell's Politics and the English Language. Stupid, uninformed, and racist, which is a pretty good package. I could have added all of these, and I no doubt will. But enough of preliminaries. Let me begin. Way back in 1979, I wrote an essay against blind submission. Blind submission is the policy of removing from essays submitted to learned journals the identifying marks of the author's name and his or her academic affiliation. The idea, of course, was to facilitate a disinterested and objective assessment of the piece submitted, made independently, an assessment made independently of the distracting and extraneous factors of disciplinary prestige and previous publications. Proponents of blind submission said, why not let the submission speak for itself without the unfair and irrelevant advantage it might have if it were read through the lens of the author's body of work? In this way, it was said, editors would be judging the article's intrinsic merit, the merit it has as a standalone object without a pedigree, rather than responding to the halo of borrowed merit conferred on it by its predecessors. Now, the simplest and I think most devastating response to the intrinsic merit argument is this: looking at a piece of academic work apart from the professional networks within which it emerged is not a possible thing to do. You just can't do it. Should you somehow succeed in setting aside or discounting or ruling out all the circumstances within which the text before you was produced, what would you see? The answer is you would see nothing, or to be more precise, nothing whose meaning could be pinned down. You would see a collection of words embedded in a syntax, but independent of the very contexts you have excluded: biography, disciplinary history, professional influence, and so on. There would be no way to assign a specific significance to those words. You would be in the position of someone who found a message in a bottle, or found a manuscript missing its title page. How would you read such an orphan text? Well, you would read it as the work of someone with an imagined or hypothetical profile, someone interested in this or that question, a question with a history, someone who is a member of this or that school, a participant in this or that controversy. In short, you would be hazarding a series of guesses in an effort to put back all the extraneous information provided by the missing title page. Only then would what you are looking at have a shape to which you could put questions like, what is it arguing, or where does it fit in? Absent that speculative contextualization, you wouldn't have an it. Reading the words themselves without any assignment of authorship won't get you anywhere. Or, and it is the same thing, it will get you anywhere or everywhere. For the meanings that might be attached to words and sentences divorced from any intentional anchor constitute an infinite set. You can always ask, what would these words be saying if Kant wrote them, or William Wordsworth wrote them, or Elvis Presley wrote them? There is no natural end to the exercise. You could go on forever trying out this or that hypothetical author, and you would never get any closer to determining this text's meaning. Blind submission is not only a bad idea, it is an unrealizable idea. It can't be done. You can't read a text as if it came from nowhere and from no one. And if you think you're doing it, what you're really doing is substituting for the actual excluded interpretive and intentional context, the interpretive and intentional context you have been forced to fabricate in the absence of the real one. This is indeed a curious procedure to remove from the field of interpretation everything that might guide it. But that's what blind submission does. Now, I'm not saying that implementing blind submission, which in fact, by the way, when I wrote this essay in 1979, I engaged in a battle which I've long since lost. Blind submission is now a policy many learned journals not only adopt, but they adopt with a tone of self-congratulation. I am not saying that implementing blind submission will have no effect, just that it won't have the effect often claimed for it, which is the effect of making the decision process purer and more objective. Blind submission might have the effect of proving the chances of scholars from out-of-the-way schools. They would no longer be in competition with well-established names. And it also might have the effect of increasing the percentage of publications authored by minorities. But these would be political changes, not changes necessarily in the overall quality of what got published. Do you want to democratize scholarship by shaking up the mix, which is an impossible objective, but I should add, not an academic one. Democracy has nothing to do with the academy, and once you link the two, you've gone down a bad road. So let me go back to that sentence. Do you want to democratize scholarship by shaking up the mix? Then blind submission may well be your cup of tea. Or do you think that scholars with track records will generally have more to offer than newcomers to the game, no matter how smart the newcomers may be? Then blind submission will seem to you, as it seems to me, to be a social justice experiment of which we should be wary. I'd say, in general, academics should always be wary of social justice experiments. Social justice is a fine thing, but it's not a fine academic thing. It has nothing to do with the academy. Then if you distrust blind submission, as I do, it will seem to you to be a social justice experiment of which we should be wary because it elevates diversity over insight and illumination. Either way, whether you have blind submission or not, there will be advantaged and disadvantaged constituencies, but in neither case will you have an advancement in the direction of a general fairness or an across-the-board regime of equal respect. That's not going to happen. Ever, ever, ever. That's not going to happen. If only because if it did, the result would be universal acceptance of everything and the elimination of judgment. It would be like giving a prize to everyone for just showing up. Now, blind submission as a policy is a small instance of a larger perennial project. And this is the project that's the object of attack in this paper. And that's the project of abstracting away from human perspectives in order to get a clear sight of human production. Doesn't that sound odd when it's said that way? Especially human verbal production. In what follows, I want to line up some other versions of that project. And I will be arguing that each of these, in somewhat different but finally similar ways, holds out the hope of moving from data, untethered from textual normative moorings, to a grounded normative regime. You can't get from data to anything. That is, the big data hype is entirely a mistake. The collections of data, no matter how mountainous, will never get you anywhere legitimately. Now, anti-professionalism is the general stance of which blind submission, as I've described it, is one byproduct. If it is argued that the standard submission process is an obstacle to the identification of intrinsic merit, and by the way, there's no such thing as intrinsic merit, if it is argued that the standard submission process is an obstacle to the identification of intrinsic merit, isn't this true necessarily of the entire machinery of professionalism? The vast apparatus of colleges, departments, dean's offices, provost offices, chancellor's offices, search committees, budget committees, tenure committees, ranking systems, local and national conventions, officially recognized journals, discipline-awarded prizes, certificates of accreditation, advanced and more advanced degrees. This whole apparatus, whose primary business, it would seem, is to replicate itself. Professions are routinely the object of the accusation that rather than serving some ideal, like the delivery of medical service or the dispensing of justice or the celebration of poetry, rather than serving those ideals, professions serve themselves and work to protect and extend the gatekeeping power they jealously and zealously guide. The flourishing of the profession, it is said, replaces the flourishing of health, justice, and the aesthetic excellence, and this betrayal is furthered by educational institutions designed to consolidate and restock entrenched hierarchies, institutions where neophyte practitioners, and I am quoting, become acculturated to an unnecessarily limited way of seeing and experiencing a way which can separate those who live within those institutions from their own sense of humanities and their own values. People write drivel like that all the time. That is, they're in search of the authentic self or an authentic set of values, and they think that they're going to get there by peeling away everything that hundreds of years of civilization have managed to produce. And this is the project that I find so absurd. We see in a statement like the one that I just quoted a distinction made between authentic human values on the one hand. They're supposedly good. If any of you can ever find one, please call me up immediately and tell me what it is. We just see a distinction between authentic human values and the values manufactured and imposed by special interest agendas that substitute themselves for the core human interests they claim to further. Again, that's the language. But what are these authentic values? Where do they come from? How do you get access to them? Well, they are what you find when what Theodor Adorno calls the prevailing realm of purposes, and Max Horkheimer calls the categories which now rule social life are dismantled piece by piece. Dismantled to reveal what? If, as Adorno, Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and Habermas repeatedly tell us, the prevailing realm of purposes flows into everything, including our efforts to dislodge it through the exercise of so-called critical thinking, how do we even begin this dismantling? And I will take anyone here to the most expensive meal in Lisbon if he or she can define critical thinking. You know, what an empty phrase. If the realm of purposes is really that prevailing, how could we even get a sight of it, preliminary to undoing it? Where could we stand? We can't, because what Roberto Unger terms the background plan, rather than being something we can think about, is what we think within. We can't step to the side of it or view it askance, and so the dream of getting away from it is always a non-starter. Now, the background plan of professions, the background plan of professions, the realm of prevailing purposes within practitioners' act, are not generally totalizing. They do not fill every nook and cranny of everyday life. But they do fill every nook and cranny of the professional lives of those who self-identify as lawyers or judges or critics or historians or literary analysts. If you are one of these, that is, if you are a member of some profession or practice, you live and move and have your being in what Thomas Kuhn calls a paradigm, and what Wittgenstein calls a life world, and what I call an interpretive community. And the paradigm or life world or community furnishes you both with the possible courses of action you might contemplate and the resources for prosecuting them. When you enter a practice's space, you know without reflection what texts there are to be completed, the tools you should bring to that task, the protocols presiding over that task, the objections that you might have to the work of others in the field, the responses you might make to criticisms of your performance. All this and more is given to you by the profession's prevailing norms and is part of the way you think and move once you have been initiated into the profession. Also given to you are the paths of critique that you might go down should you wish to challenge the profession's norms. That challenge can be mounted, but it will take the shape allowed by the very entity it is challenging. And if the challenge is occasionally successful, if something in the existing order of things is changed or even expelled, the prevailing realm will still prevail, although in altered form. So I come to my usual conclusion. Sweeping away the structures and protocols that preside over and configure a professional practice will result not in a purer form of that practice, but in its disappearance. Once you take that away, you have nothing. You can't just do law. You can't just do literary criticism. These activities only exist in a form defined and constituted by the formal categories and procedures that mark professional membership. To be sure, neither the shape nor the content of these categories and procedures is fixed. My account is not a recipe for the status quo. It is always possible, although not inevitable, to step back from the practice of which you are a member and then reflect on the divergence of its present state from the ideal it is supposed to realize. You can then act in ways designed to bring the practice closer to that ideal as you understand it. That's a possible thing to do. But it is important to note is that this kind of reflection, engaged at times by all of us, does not issue from a special muscle of the mind that stands apart from all context, but can be brought to bear like a powerful searchlight on any context. There is no general capacity of reflection. Reflection is not something you can do as a general act. Rather, there are only particular acts of reflection that have been provoked by the perception of a specific disparity between what the practice promises and what it is currently delivered. Reflection, in other words, is a local activity and has no generality beyond the local instances in which it operates. Reflection always has the shape allowed and demanded by its object. So, in a sense, there is no such thing as expression, as reflection. Anti-professionalism with a small a, that is what by anti-professional with a small I mean when you look around in the space in which you operate and say, look, that's not working, let's fix it. Let's do something to fix it. Always possible. Anti-professionalism with a small a can rearrange the institutional map in ways advantageous to this or that constituency. But anti-professionalism with a small a cannot in time produce a map that shows only advantaged constituencies, no disproportions, no inequalities, no discrimination, no unfairness, everyone in every point of view acknowledged and accorded respect. Just throw all that stuff out the window. You're never going to get it, ever, ever, ever. That, however, is the Eden promised by anti-professionalists with a large A, who tell us that piecemeal remedies, a little bit here, a little bit over there, will not do the job because it is the entire structure from the background plan down to the smallest detail that is disfigured by inequities. Not renovation, but wholesale demolition, followed by total reconstruction, is required for a new, fully equitable beginning. Everything must go. That's the rhetoric. But if everything goes, no action in any direction, positive or negative, is possible. Without a realm of prevailing purposes in place, no initiative is even thinkable. Strong anti-professionalism, like blind submission, is a non-starter. You can't do it. Now, interdisciplinarity, which everyone loves as a matter of course, interdisciplinarity is anti-professionalism cousin. And it comes in two forms, one commonplace and theoretically uninteresting, the other theoretically ambitious and impossible to perform. Commonplace, or as I call it, opportunistic interdisciplinarity, involves looking to other disciplines for materials and models that might help you solve a problem in the discipline you call home. We all do that. If I'm a literary critic, as I once was, to my shame, if I'm a literary critic trying to figure out what a poem means, I might look to linguistics or anthropology or to the history of science or to psychology to see if there is something in these fields I might appropriate to further my interpretive effort. Appropriate is a word carefully chosen. It means to take something from someone else's cupboard and make it one's own. The material or model that you borrow has a particular significance and value in the discipline in which it grew. Your interest in it, however, is keyed to the role it might play in your project, which is not a project at all in its native soil. So you pluck out this model or piece of material and make it grist for your mill. And when it has done the work you hoped it would do, when it takes you a bit further on the road you wanted to travel, you discard it or put it back on the shelf. And that's what I call opportunistic interdisciplinarity, and it's a very good thing. We all do it all the time. This kind of interdisciplinarity doesn't expand the discipline's boundaries or call them into question. Aren't you all tired of calling things into question? Come on. Now, this should have disappeared 35 years ago. Maybe it did and nobody noticed. This kind of interdisciplinarity doesn't expand the discipline's boundaries or call them into question. It just adds to the discipline's effectiveness as defined in its own terms. That is, the discipline's own terms. Now, the more ambitious version of interdisciplinarity, the one that you can never perform, regards the discipline's own terms as disastrously limiting, as the putting on of blinders, as the deliberate ignoring of the fact that disciplines and disciplinary objects do not frame themselves but become visible by virtue of a diacritical relationship with what they are not. Rather than looking at the isolated object text or the narrow discipline in which it seems to be located, we must, says one apostle of interdisciplinarity, make the object of study the whole intellectual system of relations that connects one text to another, the matrix or master code, the cultural text. Now, it is certainly possible to display in a map the whole intertextual system of relationships that carves out the spaces in which particular objects and professional objects emerge. But once you have done that, what have you done? What are you looking at? What happens when the angle of sight is widened to take in the entire panorama in relation to which the object, along with the discipline that houses it, is merely a dot in a constellation of dots? What happens is that you no longer see the object. That's what happens. You don't have a fix on it. It has disappeared into the totality of the conditions that ultimately produce it. A strong, as opposed to an opportunistic interdisciplinarity, promises a richer understanding of the object whose properties are not its own, but belong to an ever-expanding matrix. But in fact, strong interdisciplinarity precludes any understanding of the object from which it abstracts away. You only see the forest and not any of the trees. Now, if I want to figure out something about Paradise Lost, I turn to the tradition of literary epic, to Milton's other writings, to his biography, to the texts he is known to have read, to the areas of knowledge, which include theology, cosmology, music, medicine, the history of war, etc., the areas of knowledge he was expert in. I don't surround Paradise Lost with those materials as if their mere contiguity to Milton's life was explanatory. I look for evidence of the contribution they may have made to the task he had in mind, which he defined as to justify the ways of God to man. And I build a discipline-specific argument. That is, I stay focused, and I don't turn my eyes toward the myriad interconnections that link everything to everything else. If I did, the focus would be lost, and so would any opportunity to know anything about the poem. The mistake is always to think that you can move from the big picture all of the disciplines in a large map, to a clearer understanding of everything the picture soars above. No, what that picture soars above is what it leaves behind and what is no longer seen. So again, a piece of advice: don't fall for the lure of interdisciplinarity, and above all, don't think that you're performing some act of virtue by engaging in it. That mistake, is often politically motivated. For the apostles of strong interdisciplinarity, the narrowness of disciplines is not merely, in their eyes, an epistemological error. It is part and parcel of a concerted effort to keep us apart and closed so that we won't see what is really going on. So here's a quote by a strong interdisciplinary scholar. Specialized academic disciplines contribute to overall domination by refusing a view of totality that is desperately needed in this stage of world capitalism, sexism, and racism. If I ever wrote a sentence like that, I'd shoot myself immediately. Here's another one. Cultural studies, quote, aims to overcome the disabling fragmentation of knowledge within the disciplinary structure of the university, and also to overcome the fragmentation and alienation of the larger society which that structure mirrors. And here is one of the, this is not in the paper, but I can't resist. Here's one of the things that comes along with this view, that the view of that interdisciplinarity of a stronger kind will make you a less parochial person than you would have been. It's part of that myth by which literary critics and other professional academics come to believe that if they affect a change in their discipline, they will affect a change in the world. If I can somehow produce a better interpretation of the Divine Comedy, for example, I will then contribute to the project of refining the human experience. How could anyone believe such drivel? But a lot of people do. Here's the story that strong interdisciplinary polemicists tell us. If we come to see that disciplinary boundaries are artificial, and I certainly agree with that, drawn with proprietary and exclusionary motives, and I agree with that too, and designed to prevent us from participating in a common humanity that is obscured by illegitimate and malevolent distinctions, if we perform this act, we will extend that academic lesson beyond the academy and begin the work of building a better, more capacious, freer society. If that's something that you want to do, and I've said this before in other publications, if that's what you want to do, get out of the academy, because that's not the academy's business. Or to go to the title of one, if you want to save the world, go into the world. Don't stay in the ivory tower. So that it's a kind of bonus also in this argument which has us building a better, more capacious, freer society because we have refined our interpretation of Dante's Divine Comedy. And as a kind of bonus, in the course of doing that, we are told, we will be building a better, more capacious, and freer self. Here the argument is simple and appealing, although entirely specious. When congealed categories in description and evaluation are loosened and exposed as contingent, revisable, and dispensable rather than fixed and natural, the mind, freed from their grip, becomes a progressively better instrument. Cultural studies or strong interdisciplinarity not only promises a purification of the tools of knowledge, it promises a purification of the knower, who will no longer be confined to limited horizons, but will grow into full and inclusive perception. The name of this progressive enlargement of mind is consciousness raising, another attractive but impossible thing to do. Consciousness raising is a concept, as you know, that is central to many discourses: Marxism, feminism, Frankfurt School dialectic, critical theory, Habermas's universal pragmatics, some forms of deconstruction, critical social practice, etc. Okay? Now, in any of its versions, consciousness raising begins by declaring that our sense of what is possible is determined by deep structures of education, political systems, entrenched social attitudes of which we are unaware. And that, of course, is certainly true. In our unawareness, it is then said, we believe that our present condition is inevitable and deserved, and so we live lives of resignation and obedience. The remedy is to surface those structures so that we can see the extent to which our complacent relationship to them hinders, if not prevents, any effort to understand our true situation and pursue ways of changing that situation. The goal, then, is liberation. That's conscious raising goal. And here is the statement of, by, again, someone who urges it. Liberation in the form of a state of reflective clarity in which people know which of their wants are genuine because they know finally who they really are. And this is also a state of collective autonomy in which persons have the power to determine rationally and freely the nature and direction of their collective existence. Sounds great, but forget it. The means to this goal include extended communal discussions in which women, gays, blacks, in the United States, Latinos, and others tell one another their stories of being dominated, marginalized, and oppressed, and resolve in the work of, I don't know if any of you remember the movie Network from about 40 years ago, but there's a character in there named Howard Beale who says, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." And that's the consciousness raising impulse. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. So women in these conversations realize the degree to which they live in a world saturated with male norms. That, of course, is true. Those living in poverty learn that their economic disadvantage is owed not to their personal inadequacies, but to predatory financial practices that put them behind the eight ball from the very beginning. And minorities in general learn that the disparity between their numbers and their representation in boardrooms, faculty meetings, and upper management is less a matter of aptitude and ability and more a matter of quotas enforced by invisible and unacknowledged filters. Okay, you all know this discourse. And in the same vein, 1,000 other lessons are waiting to be learned as one marginalized or disadvantaged group after another discovers its true hidden history. And that's the rub. Each of these lessons, each of these revolutions in awareness is local. That is, it occurs in a specific context where a particular grievance is being articulated and a particular set of remedial actions is being urged. And these twined or twinned activities, becoming aware of a systemic wrong and resolving to do something about it, are performed against a background of hierarchies and discriminations of which we are not at the moment aware, and in the absence of which we could not continue. We cannot take a step forward without having something to stand on, some in-place structure of norms and protocols that issues from an angled perspective of the very kind we are trying to leave behind. And if we remove or deconstruct that perspective, another, equally angled, will already have slipped beneath our feet and constituted an unexamined underpinning that will have to be deconstructed in turn, and on and on and on. Awareness. So now this is the attack on awareness. Awareness, like reflection, is not the name of a capacity that can be extended until it fills the field of consciousness. Consciousness will always be made up of a mixture of awareness and unawareness, of openness and closure, The content of these two categories can and certainly does change. The light shining over here will always leave a dark corner over there, but the change will result not in a consciousness ever more aware and more open, but in a consciousness differently closed. That's your choice, not between a closed consciousness and an open consciousness, but consciousnesses, states of consciousness differently closed. You can't raise consciousness generally by just adding a bit of enlightenment here and there together, as if consciousness were a quality always capable of being augmented. All you can do, and after all, it's quite a lot, is reconfigure consciousness so that some, not all, of the inequities previously invisible to those who performed and suffered them are made obvious and become candidates for redress. It is often said that the object of consciousness raising is the diminishing or even the eliminating of false consciousness. All consciousness is false. All consciousness is false if the measure of true consciousness is a way of thinking that does not rest on a substratum of unexamined assumptions and presently unnoticed exclusion. There will always be a remainder, and when we turn our attention to that remainder, the very act of doing so will create another. The appeal of consciousness raising is the appeal we have met before, a method by means of which we can detach ourselves from fallible, limited ways of seeing and being and approach the world and its tasks free of the liabilities that come along with being finite, situated, and interest-laden creatures. One very up-to-date version of that method, the way in which we're going to rise above our human limitations, is called transparency. One of the worst of all. Transparency, if it were possible, and it's not, is that state of perception in which things are seen directly and clearly, without the obscuring, obfuscating, and distorting effects of screens and filters. Screens can take many forms. Practices of secrecy, like passcodes or partners-only meetings, fact-hoarding, need-to-know basis policies, materials stamped classified, impenetrable technical jargon, confidentiality agreements, claims of privilege, selective curating by redaction or executive summary, reverence-inspiring stage scenery, like the curtain which, when drawn, reveals the Wizard of Oz to be an unimpressive little old man. Those who employ screens often claim benign rather than strategic motives. They say, we want to protect national security. We don't want to overload the public's attention. They say, too much information indiscriminately broadcast lessens the efficiency of an operation. They say public disclosure of one's feelings and emotional life can lead to the loss of reputation and the rupture of sustained friendships. Those are all of the things said by those who argue for screens and against transparency. But in recent decades, those considerations have been outweighed by the polemical rhetoric of transparency, which sounds so good. Openness rather than smoke-filled rooms. The public's right to know. To know what? The public's right to know. The priority of accountability. The imperative to detect corruption. That is, we can't let them get away with it behind closed doors. And above all, the democratizing of information as being necessary to a free society populated by free citizens. That's just a part of transparency's rhetoric. Then I ask, free to do what? The answer is implicit in the key assumption informing the ethic of transparency. The assumption is that the more data we have at our access, the more data we have access to, the clearer will be our understanding both of where we are and where we should be. We will look at the body of ever-proliferating and unfiltered data, and it will tell us what there is to know. And we can go from that to what there is to do. This I call the theology of data. Its scripture is, "You shall meet the data face to face, and the data shall make you free." The data so imagined cannot be selectively assembled, for that would mean that the direction uncurated information was to provide would be replaced by the direction preferred by those who filtered it, and we as data consumers would be at their mercy. It is necessary, we are told, to emancipate the data from those who would control it, so that we ourselves can be emancipated from any control and range freely. Again, the purification of the tools of knowledge is at the same time presented as the purification of the knower. The problem, and by now you can probably anticipate what I'm going to say, the problem is that data, uncurated and unfiltered, doesn't have any direction. It points nowhere and everywhere. When you are confronted with a lot of stuff that just keeps coming and has no shape or innumerable shapes, you need help. You are not enlightened, you are paralyzed. You are overwhelmed. And in today's data information culture, help comes in the form of private companies like Facebook that do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, but in a way always that advances their interests and not ours. Here's the sequence. First, there is the tsunami of unbounded and random data that must somehow be utilized and managed. But the skills required are not ones most citizens possess. Enter the, quote, unelected mediators, unquote, entrepreneurs with powerful algorithms who ask us to buy back the data made available to us now in a digestible form. But of course, the digesting has already been done, and in our relative incompetence, we can only accept it, thus realizing a lesson delivered long ago by Gilles Deleuze, quote, "New forms of emancipation are always simultaneously forms of control and regulation." So control and regulation, supposedly circumvented by unfiltered data, come back unacknowledged and with disastrous consequences. Because data manipulators do not advertise themselves as manipulators, they are able to prosecute their ends under the cover of what appears to be impersonal, objective statistics. And in the process, we become data subjects, more enthralled than we were before, more in thrall than we were before we bought into this latest promise of liberation from ourselves, from the state of being human. The transparency promise, like others I have discussed, is not redeemable. Those who claim to have redeemed it perform a sleight of hand. They do something that can't be done. Assess the merit of journal submissions from which all identifying marks have been removed, or determine the meaning of a text independently of the author's intention or the history of its invention, or reveal the genuine self by divesting it of everything that makes it identifiable as an entity, etc. People do that, but they do that something by bringing in through the back door everything that has been sent away up front. Okay, you have blind submission as a policy. What's the result? You guess at the authorship of an orphan text, and so restore, but in a fictional form, the credentials you have discarded. You presuppose, without being aware of it, the disciplinary norms you are rhetorically pushing away. You invent a role called the authentic self, and then fill its empty form with vague, lefty, feel-good sentiments. You tout the clarifying power of data, but hide the interests that have configured it for purposes never announced and perhaps not known. You get back, as I have already said, what you had loudly exiled, but you get it back in a wholly unaccountable form. Okay. Once we see that transparency is not an absolute value, but is the name of a strategy, you also see that openness is not and could not be an end in itself, guaranteed to produce benign outcomes. Be ye open is not the master rule that all progressives should follow. Rather, be open sometimes, but at other times not. Like reflection, awareness, and consciousness raising, openness cannot be a general policy because it has no content, no built-in direction, and any content or direction it seems to have will have been borrowed from a confining context of the kind it claims to free us from. Let me say that again. Openness cannot be a general policy because it has no content, no built-in direction, and any content or direction it seems to have will have been borrowed from a confining context of the very kind it claims to free us from. It's always openness with respect to this or that situational problem, openness as defined and given shape by the background of practices. It's never just openness, just as it's never just reflection or awareness. There is no such thing. Final section. Transparency and openness thus add themselves to the list of panaceas that promise to lift us above human frailties to the point where vision and action are purified and perfected. That promise, as I have noted, is never fulfilled and never could be. However, the appeal of it persists. The lure of a method that will transform us, usually by peeling away parts of us, is perennial and powerful. And there is never a lack of prophets or hucksters eager to sell us the latest good for all our ills elixir. At the present time, the most durable of these lures is called artificial intelligence. The goal of artificial intelligence is machine simulation of human intelligence. Questions have always surrounded the project, which has been around in its present form since the mid-1950s, although its antecedents can be said to go back to Plato. Some of those questions are, what exactly is human intelligence? How does it exhibit itself? What tests will indicate whether simulation by machine has in fact been achieved? One influential answer to this last question was proposed in the 1950s by the British mathematician Alan Turing in the form of his famous Turing test. He said, suppose you are putting questions to two entities, a human being and a computer. You don't know at the beginning which is which because they are both placed behind a screen or in another room. If after a time of questioning and answering, you cannot tell which of your interlocutors is a person and which is a machine, you are warranted in concluding that both are exhibiting intelligent human behavior. So that's the Turing test. If you can set it up so that you can't tell the difference between someone who is responding to you, who is human, and the responses given by a machine, then the Turing test has been passed. A famous counter-argument was mounted in 1980 by the philosopher John Searle, who proposed this hypothetical, known as the Chinese room hypothetical. Some of you may know it. Imagine a native English speaker who knows no Chinese, locked in a room full of boxes of Chinese symbols, that is, a database, together with a book of instructions for manipulating the symbols, that's the program. Now imagine the people outside the room send in other Chinese symbols, which, unknown to the person in the room, are questions in Chinese. That's the input. And imagine that by following the instructions in the program, the man in the room is able to pass out Chinese symbols which are correct answers to the questions. That's the output. The program enables the person in the room to pass the Turing test for understanding Chinese, but he does not understand a word of Chinese. In short, the man in the room has performed an operation, and the operation was successful, but he had no understanding of what he was doing. He was not engaged in conscious human activity. Following the program's instructions, he could manipulate Chinese symbols simply by consulting the program and performing its steps without knowing the meaning of the symbols or consciously participating in the project of which they were components. Those outside the room who are on the receiving end of the sequence are justified, although mistaken, in believing that the man in the room speaks Chinese. But all he has done is mechanically implement a program that simulates Chinese speaker behavior, but in no way matches it. The Turing test may have been passed, human behavior has been mimed, but it has not been duplicated. Why not? The answer was given to us long ago, in 1972, in a book by a philosopher named Hubert Dreyfus called What Computers Can't Do, which is as relevant and true now as it was then. What Dreyfus said is that computers are existentially dumb. As dumb as I would be if after my automobile had broken down in a remote area, I was listening to a voice on the telephone. That is, a mechanic I was able to reach. I was listening to a voice on the telephone telling me to find a cylindrically shaped object under the hood and take it out of a hole. And then, after I did that, do something else, and then something else, and then something else. I would be following steps in a formal sequence. First, put this object, pull this object out, and put that other one in. But I would be doing so without knowing, in any interesting sense of the word, what I was doing or why I was doing it. The automobile might get started at some point. But from my point of view, which would be the point of view of the executor of the program, I might as well have said abracadabra 5 times to achieve the result I still would not understand. As I carried out the sequence, I would not be a thinking, conscious being, but the mechanical extension of the programmer on the phone, my mechanic, who did know what he was talking about, one hopes. Now, the distinction between a computing human being, and a human being, is the subject of Dreyfus's book. And he explains that computers are not embodied. They are not in a situation. That is, in fact, is, of course, the claim made for them by AI apostles. They're not in a situation. They transcend or exist at a more basic level than situations. Now, at that level, the facts computers can pick out, various formal regularities, are always the same. Relevance is not a quality or feature computers can discern or measure. Although relevance can be built into a computer program that instructs you, for example, never to pay attention to words that begin with the letter X, or instructs you always pay attention to objects within 5 feet of you. It is the ability of a computer to produce that program, always pay attention to objects within 5 feet of you, that underlies the project of self-driving automobiles, of which I will say more in a moment. Human beings, Dreyfus points out, do not do relevance that way by adhering to an in advance formal specification of what must be attended to and what can be ignored. Rather, and I am quoting Dreyfus, because the human world is pre-structured in terms of human purposes, intentions, and concerns, that structure, which is not something the human being grasps, but something he or she inhabits, is always and already foregrounding some objects, events, and paths of inquiry, and it is these objects, events, and paths of inquiries that the situated human agent will register, not as an act of will, but as a constituent of his or her situational perception. Given the concern embedded in and constitutive of any social context, to win a game, to solve a problem, to decide on a course of action, relevance is pre-given. If you're in a situation in which you're trying to do one of these things, you don't have to ask the question of relevance because it's pre-given as along with your membership in the situation. Relevance is pre-given and need not and could not be sought by a search engine. It is a feature of human situations that the relevancies appropriate to them can change and change suddenly when new information emerges or unanticipated events occurs, and when that happens, the situated agent will respond on the wing, taking cues from wherever he or she finds them, re-seeing on the spot and without formal calculation what matters and what does not. As the philosopher Daniel Dennett has pointed out, nothing matters for a machine, or everything matters for a machine. At such moment, Dreyfus observes, genuine thinking of the kind we recognize will be occurring. That is, when we're actually acting as human beings. And here's what his description of what it is like to try to think through a problem. The challenge, the stage of productive confusion, the promising leads, the partial solutions that do not pan out, the flash appearance of a stable solution in the form of some kind of unanticipated intuition, the structural changes brought about by the pressure of changing total situations, the resemblance suddenly discovered among different patterns. Now, in recent decades, the possibility of machines simulating that kind of on-the-fly learning has been attached to programs based on neural networks. That is, neural networks rather than on an explicit formal definition of sequence operations, which is what the digital computer was able to do. Such programs based on neural networks can, in a sense, learn. Initial state conditions are matched with goals. That is, we want to get from present condition X to better condition Y. And then, by a trial and error method, it's called deep reinforcement learning, the best path to reaching the goal is determined by adding pieces of technology to deal with anticipated and unanticipated difficulties. Okay, that's the way it works. The program that implements that goal, let's say that the goal is driving a car safely. That is, a car that is a self-driving automobile. The program that implements that goal will be equipped with sensors, lasers, and cameras that will recognize and register the movements of other vehicles, will read road signs, detect traffic lights, be alert to pedestrians, and adjust speed and direction. And it will be able to do these things not in a fixed order, but in response to changing driving conditions. And that's what the present state of driverless cars allows you to do, and it's really extraordinary. This is no doubt a significant achievement. But is the program operating with the reflex we associate with a skilled driver who relies on subtle clues and nonverbal communications like making eye contact with the pedestrian or reading the facial expression of other drivers to make split-second judgment calls? And all of you who have driven know that that's exactly what it's like. I suspect not, and my suspicion is that driverless cars will never perform as well or better than human drivers. The reason is simple. While it is possible to add technological fixes when a previously uncontemplated glitch or problem comes to our attention, the number of glitches and problems is not finite and is constantly increasing, especially in open-ended and complex environments like the environment of automobile driving. No list of glitches can ever be complete, which means that the technology will always run behind the difficulties it has not yet detected. And that is why so many of these cars crash in ways that are made popular by the Fast and Furious series. Some of you have no doubt seen it. Now, this is obviously less true of a relatively bounded environment like the environment of a room you are trying to vacuum. And if you want to understand how these machines work and why they are in their own way marvelous, you can look on the internet and you will find descriptions of the way in which robot vacuums operate and what makes them able to do the kinds of things that they do. And I think for me, the single most compelling detail, compelling in the sense that it led me to see exactly what the accomplishment was and what the limitations are, is if you're vacuuming a room, but the room that you want to vacuum, there's a series of 3 steps that leads down into another room, the danger is that your vacuum, your robot vacuum, will not not know about the 3 steps and will attempt to negotiate them and will fall to its own destruction. The remedy? Quite simple. The remedy is that the vacuum cleaner, the robot vacuum cleaner, as it moves around your room, sends a signal to the floor, and the floor sends the signal back. And the floor is supposed to send the signal back in a finite, small amount of time. If the signal doesn't come back, this is a sign to the computer that the terrain that is now to be negotiated is not stable, and the computer will instruct the vacuum cleaner to back up, to stop and back up. That's quite an extraordinary thing, and I think is to be commended. But in non-bounded situations like driving cars on freeways or in the city, deep reinforcement learning can never catch up with the fact, as one critic put it, real-world problems take place in a changing world. Human beings don't have to catch up by adding an item to a list of variables. When a change in the situation occurs, they just immediately register it in a way that alters ever so slightly the shape of consciousness, and then they go forward within a slightly reconfigured structure of purpose and concern. Now, John Searle is more optimistic than I am about the possibility of a fully successful driverless car. But when he asks himself, in a YouTube video which I recommend, when he asks himself, what are the philosophical implications of a car that fully drives itself? He answers his own question with the word none. None, because the self-driving car, at whatever level of perfection, is an engineering achievement, not an achievement of consciousness. It's an engineering achievement. The complex actions the program performs are not actions of which it is aware. It literally doesn't know what it is doing any more than a light switch, which is a low-level computer, knows that it is turning a light on or off. Let's concede, nevertheless, of course, that computers can do many things: calculate, match, recognize patterns, play world-class chess, win at Jeopardy, robot clean rooms, and parallel park cars. But they do these things in the absence of strategies, desires, wonderings, and curiosities, that is, in the absence of all the motives that move human beings to act. And you can't reason back from the bare precipitate of those motives, from the numbers, frequencies, and collocation patterns a search engine can reveal and track, to the motives themselves. You can't get back from the data to the gestalt or life world within which shapes appear and are instantly and without reflection intelligible. You can't sever the data from the circumstances of their intentional production and think that by looking at outputs so severed, you can bootstrap yourself back up to the richness of the circumstantial field. You can count, calculate, and compute till the cows come home, or until Jesus Christ returns, whichever metaphor you prefer, but you will never be a millimeter closer to the protean nature of the human ability to make sense. Now, in 2022, and even more recently, a Google chat box was declared by a Google engineer to be sentient. That is, not only able to calculate and execute a program, to be doing so in ways that made it conscious. He was, I'm happy to say, promptly fired. But that hasn't stopped that optimism. All right. Now, this chat box, Google's chat box, is certainly capable of participating in any number of conversations about any number of things, domestic, political, social, literary, etc. It is good, as Daniel Dennett pointed out, at counterfeiting human behavior and deceiving us. Not intentionally, of course. If it were intentionally deceiving us, it would have a consciousness. But as Richard Carrier pointed out, the program does not in any sense understand the responses it gives to questions. It just takes the word in a question and searches in a vast database for other words or phrases that appear often in conjunction with them. And here I quote Carrier. If you ask the program to tell you whether a toilet is likely to be found in a residence, it just looks for statistical associations between the two words, never at any time assessing any model of what toilets and residences even are. It is not aware of either toilets or residences. It doesn't know anything about these things. All it knows is statistical associations between words. And that's perfect, I think. Genuine knowing and being aware are forever beyond it, no matter how sophisticated the machinery. Hence, the conclusion of one critic of the artificial intelligence project: computer power cannot and should not replace human reason with something less flexible and less resourceful than it. But of course, that has been the project of all of the agendas I have surveyed, to perfect the human by reducing it to what is measurable in its behaviors. Everything important is left out, and is left out deliberately, in the conviction that by abstracting away from the messy contingencies of human action, we can arrive at what at bottom really matters. We can arrive at intrinsic merit, or purely textual meaning, or the pure fact of fact or raw data, or at the authentic, unencumbered self. We can arrive at professional activity divorced from the norms of any profession or discipline. We can arrive at generated objects seen from the vantage point of many disciplines or no disciplines. We can arrive at a consciousness free of angles, interest, or investments, or life. We can experience things directly without the interposition of screens, filters, gatekeepers, et cetera, et cetera. We can have a mind exercising its powers of calculation unaffected, unclouded by ambition, affections, goals, fears, and life projects. What I have been arguing is that you're not going to get there, although you can hazard an approximation by stigmatizing and exiling considerations that you think muck up human reasoning. And that's what Habermas does when he invents something, as some of you may call the ideal speech situation, which he says you reach by exiling from the realm of argument all arguments that are either are either instrumental, that is designed to do a specific thing, or are rooted in particular interests, so that you get rid of all arguments that are instrumental or self-interested and then you can begin the ideal speech situation. But if you could do that, you'd already be in the ideal speech situation. How can you be in the position where you could recognize which arguments were instrumental and which were personal, and which are, as Habermas says in a circular fashion, are the better arguments? Habermas thinks that he can start his project by identifying the better objects, but the better arguments. What he doesn't see is that if he could identify the better arguments, there would be no need for his project. It would already be over, and there will never be any such identifications. But this is what all these agendas want to do. They want to exile considerations that they believe muck up human reasoning, and then proclaim that the impoverished form of life we have arrived at is superior to the layered and contingent fullness you have left behind in your brave new world. Why, in the wake of so many failures, this project has been attempted innumerable times, it always fails. It's this project of cleaning up human behavior. Why is it always renewable? What is it that these projectors, to use an 18th century term, are seeking? The short answer is that they are seeking purity. And we can see what purity comprises and why it will not be achieved by looking at two traditions of thought, the Platonic and the religious. In the Phaedrus and elsewhere, Plato, through Socrates, speaks of the human soul as having moved away from a happy prior state when it gazed on reality itself, having declined into mortality, that is, seeing through rather than seeing, having declined into mortality, Socrates continues, the soul's memory of its former state is tenuous at best, and it is only by a great effort that the soul can rise above earthly perceptions, separate itself from the busy interests of men, and begin once again to approach the divine, which, says Socrates, is without shape or color and is intangible. In the Christian tradition, this same story is told in a single verse of the Bible. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as I am known. 1 Corinthians 13. To know as you are known is to eliminate entirely the distance between the knower and what he seeks to know. You don't know about, you know in the deepest sense possible, where knowledge becomes identity. The desiring self is no more because desire has been so satisfied that the self as a distinct entity is no more. It has been absorbed into the reality it sought. It has no boundaries that mark it off from anything else. It is not framed against the background on which its identity depends. It frames itself because it frames itself, it is not seeable from the outside. It is invisible, without shape, without color, and intangible. Now, that is a glorious vision, and I blame no one for celebrating and desiring it. But unfortunately, it is incapable of being realized in the veil of tears we call human life. And it certainly won't be realized by any of the proffered paths to salvation considered in this essay. I began with blind submission as a minor policy in the context of scholarly publishing. I end with the grand project of artificial intelligence, and I am here in conclusion to tell you that they are one and the same thing. That is, they are one and the same impossible things. Thank you. someone should. Are there questions, cries of outrage, supporting anecdotes, anything that you would have to offer? I would much appreciate it. This paper is delivered, as many of mine are, with a polemical edge that could probably not be maintained under interrogation. So why don't you begin some of the interrogation? You're going to let me get away with all of that? Someone, is there a microphone that can be handed? Here it comes.
Oh, sorry, here it comes. Thanks so much for that. And yeah, I mean, I found most of it, I think, compelling, and maybe it tickled some of my own prejudices, so I don't know. But I suppose the blind submission, I know what you mean, but you seem to dismiss the political aspect of what's going on in academia as either unimportant or not academic. And I guess my question would be, there are clearly structural injustices and structural prejudices which this is trying to get over. Do those not matter, or what redress is there for the everybody's got to produce their first article, so how does that come about, I guess, is the question.
Of course it matters, and it can be extremely, how shall I say, negative and delimiting in its effects. That is, structural conditions. We now talk easily of things like structural racism or cultural discrimination, both of which refer to forms of perception and organization so deeply in place that those who live within them are not even aware that it could be any other way. And that's certainly true also of the academy. When I and my wife, who's a literary theorist herself, the name of Jane Tompkins, when Jane and I arrived at Duke University, not only was she the only tenured female member of an English department which has perhaps 45 to 50 members in it, she was the 5th senior woman in all of Duke University, all of the departments. This is 1985, which was kind of a long time ago, but not that long ago. Now, that wasn't the result of people sitting around deciding, let's minimize the possibilities of having women in senior positions on our faculty. That's not the way. It was the result of structural conditions which predated the entrance of any of the persons currently in power into the profession. And it's necessary to change that when you see it. This is an example of what I spoke of when I said, when you see something in the corner of your profession that seems wrong, you can move to change it. Just don't think that by changing it, you have therefore added something to the amount of freedom or intuition or awareness or reflection in the world. You've changed it. I changed it. Actually, my wife didn't want to go to Duke University because we had visited there, and she said, this place is awful. And then she explained all the reasons why it was awful, and especially why it would be awful for her, a senior scholar on the one hand, but a slim, blonde, blue-eyed woman on the other hand, or on the same hand. She said, it just won't work. I would be miserable there. And I went back and forth with her for a long time, until one day when we were having this argument, it wasn't an argument, it was more of an exchange of views, I turned to her and said, I'll change it. And that persuaded her. And I did. And I did by only hiring women for the first 2 or 3 years of my chairmanship. And one senior scholar came over to me and said, Stanley, are we ever going to hire anyone but women? And I said, no, which of course was false. But by the time that I was finished with that exercise, there were a number of strong, accomplished women faculty members sitting in the room, and that changed everything in that particular department. That's it. I don't make any. Now, it's good to do that kind of thing. Now, let's go back to blind submission. Is it the case that blind submission, the removal from submitted articles of the identifying marks of authorship and scholarly affiliation, will change things? Is it the case that it will, in fact, also perhaps bring into the academy people who would otherwise not have received recognition because the old boys network, so-called, was operating so strong? The answer to that question is yes. The next question is, okay, so what should we do then? And my answer is always going to be tread carefully. Because in a world without essences, and I believe in that, in a world without essences, in a world in which all values and virtues are produced rather than found, you should not too quickly take up the task of discarding and dismantling the structure within which you are now operating, even if the inequities it performs and allows, and even on occasion celebrates, are obvious. So to me, the question is, what do you want to protect? Do you want to protect the academic exercise of working out answers to complicated questions as best you can? Or do you want to engage in a sociological project of widening the constituency in the academy? I come down on the first prong, but I can see why people might want to come down on the second prong. And so you will not be surprised that the current keywords in the American discourse of diversity, exclusion, inclusion, and equity do not resonate with me. That seems to me just a way of substituting politics for academic work. And that is the danger that I am always attempting to ward off. The danger that academic work will become an extension of politics, and that the isolated and abstract nature of academic work, what has derisively been called the ivory tower, will be sacrificed to something supposedly larger. I love the ivory tower. I think the ivory tower is where we as academics should be. No? It's the
hello.
only...
Okay.
Where are you?
I'm here. And,
Raise your hand.
Get up.
Okay.
Hello.
Oh, yes.
So
You have more
regarding,
hair than I do.
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I'm sorry, too. Go ahead.
Regarding artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
We have seen lately a number of attempts of making art through artificial intelligence. And of course, that has its political significance, but that's not the topic here. What I hope to have your opinion in is, in the future, if ever possible, that that art made by artificial intelligence will become, at least to our eyes, indistinguishable from human-made art. How will that affect our ideas of meaning, of artistic intention, and so on?
Well, thank you for that question. As you asked it, I related the question to the old, I don't even know what to call it. It's not a problem, it's not a fable, it's just actually a talking point. Let's assume that 1,000 monkeys typing on computers could in time produce a Shakespearean sonnet. Okay, let's assume that's true, that is a possibility. What would we want to say about the artifact that was produced. What we would want to say, if we did not believe that the production was intentional, but that it was simply accidental, what we would want to say is that it simply appears to have meaning, but doesn't have meaning. Or we would want to say, and this is the same thing, that a reader who gives it meaning does so by assuming some intentional agent has designed or produced it. That is, you can't look at something, either a piece of art or a piece of verbal creation, a story or a poem. You can't look at something and construe it without assuming that it has been intentionally designed. If you're persuaded that it's not intentionally designed, then all the meaning leaches out of it. Now, I'll give you an example. It's an example drawn from an argument put forward by Justice Antonin Scalia of the United States Supreme Court, a famous conservative, also a friend of mine, but that's something else. Scalia, who wanted to argue that words have meaning independent of intentions, put forward the following example. Suppose there is a factory, a large factory, in which there are a number of laborers. And suppose there is a bell, a signal, a warning that is sounded, which tells the workers in the factory that they have to evacuate, perhaps because of a fire, perhaps because of a bomb threat, or for some other reason. Then, says Scalia, assume that that button is pressed inadvertently and certainly non-intentionally by a monkey. Monkeys always figure in these stories. By a monkey. He said, isn't it the case that all of the workers who heard the bell ring would immediately conclude that the ringing of the bell meant you must now evacuate, even though no human intention produced it? And therefore, he concluded, meaning, the apprehension of meaning, is independently of intention. Well, the response to that is very simple. Suppose that as everybody was going down the back stairs on the way to evacuating, a message came over the loudspeaker, which said, oops, sorry, it was a monkey, accidentally. What would everybody do? Turn around and go back to their stations, because they would have realized that although the sign, which had a meaning, was produced, it wasn't produced by an intentional being who wanted to design that meaning experience. Therefore, it didn't have meaning. Now, all these things are complicated. There was the famous artist whose name I will, of course, forget at a crucial moment. Some of you may be able to supply it. This is, de Kooning. Hey, that was good. You know the artist de Kooning? De Kooning lived a long life, and at the end of his life, apparently suffered from some form of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. But he continued painting. So the question is, do his paintings have the kind of significance and meaning that the paintings that he wrote before he suffered dementia or Alzheimer's had? And there's lots of answers to that question. And one answer that might be given, and that I would tend to give, is that even though the conscious construction of intentional designs may have been beyond de Kooning, his entire being, including his bodily being, was so practiced, so absorbed over the decades into producing art, that he was doing it almost as an act of vestigial memory, of memory he doesn't have. A colleague of mine once referred to this state, a state which I myself may be approaching, or you may decide I have already approached it, once referred to this state in which, rather than going through this carefully reasoned and thought through procedures, at a certain age, you just begin to kind of do it. Refer to that state as the senile sublime. Isn't that a great phrase? The senile sublime. So that's a long, roundabout, somewhat fuzzy answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Fish, for your powerful lecture. As I was listening to you, I sensed the perspective you were presenting to us could be understood to be a very grand viewpoint that encompasses many disciplines, maybe even a large interdisciplinary viewpoint.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite hearing you.
I'm sorry, is that better? Whether the viewpoint you're presenting itself could be understood as a large interdisciplinary viewpoint. At the same time as I was listening, I felt my consciousness being raised, and I could see more clearly through the disciplines of the colleagues around me. And I just wonder whether underlying this terrific synoptic vision, perhaps this is in itself another impossible thing of which I should be very cautious.
Very, very good question. Thank you for it. For years, and this, I don't know if there's anybody in the room who's in the world of legal studies. Anybody in the room in the world of legal studies? But for years, I was engaged in a series of quarrels with a very prominent legal academic by the name of Ronald Dworkin. And in fact, there's going to be a book published soon about the Fish-Dworkin debates. And I was asked in the course of an interview that will be attached to this book, what's the difference finally between you and Dworkin? And my answer was, and this speaks, I hope, to your question, is that he had a project and I don't. What I do is look at the arguments others have made for the production of this or that, or for the raising of this value as the highest value, and I take those arguments apart. But typically, as you may have noticed from this particular lecture, I don't offer anything much as a substitute for what I have taken apart. In this way, I said in the interview and say again here, there is a school of Dworkin in legal studies, a considerable and important figure. But there's no school of Fish, because you can't be a Fishian unless you want to do what I do, which is go around poking holes in everything I come across. I don't know if the world can take more than one. Maybe not. But so that's why I'd resist your suggestion, although it makes perfect sense, that I too have my own project. Another way of putting this, when I started thinking along these lines, back in, I remember the moment exactly, 1973. 1973, when I was in a seminar, teaching a seminar at the University of Southern California. And one of my colleagues, one of the early computer specialists, asked me a version of your question. And I said, look, imagine the anti-foundationalist, which is what I am. Imagine the anti-foundationalist and the foundationalist of any kind, whether there's left foundationalism, there's right foundationalism, as you all know. They're engaged in a tennis match. Who can win? And the answer is that only the foundationalist can win. The anti-foundationalist, the one who takes the stance that I have taken, can't win. Because his task, or her task, is to take a ball that's sent over the net, labeled foundation, and then send it back after having shown that it is not foundational, but contingent in a variety of ways. I have to do that every time. I can never win the game. All the opponent anti-foundationalist has to do is get one ball past me, and that game is won. So like psychoanalysis, as described by Freud, anti-foundationalism is interminable. That is, it's just a project of continued skepticism about what Lyotard calls large, grand meta-narratives of any kind. And I've spent most of my time in recent years trying to debunk or attack the large meta-narratives presented by the academic left, mainly because I am politically a member of that group, and therefore what I take to be its pretensions and insufferable self-righteousness is something that I want to continually oppose, lest I be thought of as one of these people. So that's, I have a special niche. I've managed to maintain it, as the introduction indicated, for many, many years. It's amazing. This is my 62nd year teaching in the classroom. And as far as I can tell, I'm still singing the same note, and it still has the capacity of provoking resistance. So I consider myself very fortunate in that. Anybody else? Going to allow that to be a...
Perhaps one final question?
If there is one, any question? You can ask me about anything. Kind of. Well, I guess not. No question? No. Well, then I'll end by thanking all of you, both for your attention in a lecture that was too long, and for the excellent questions that you offered, and for your being here in this early evening in Lisbon on a beautiful day. Thank you.
Chegamos ao final desta sessão. Queremos agradecer a presença de todas e de todos e desejar-lhes uma boa noite.